The producer price index, which tracks what businesses charge for goods and services, rose 0.9 of a percentage point in July. It's the largest monthly increase in more than 3 years and evidence that US President Trump's tariffs are driving up the cost of imported goods. So far, retailers have been able to shield consumers by pre-ordering inventory, but analysts say it's only a matter of time before those costs are passed on. Tariffs are also impacting the labor market, with nearly 2 million Americans receiving unemployment benefits. The U.S. Federal Reserve will meet again in September to discuss whether or not to cut interest rates. For more on the U.S. economy, let's bring in our Washington, D.C.-based panel. Joining us now is Joseph Williams. He is a former senior editor with the U.S. News and World Report. Also with us is Arthur Dong. He is a distinguished teaching professor with the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. Brandon Bryce is a conservative columnist and secretary for the Delaware Republican Party. And John Tamney is president of the Parkview Institute and editor of Real Clear Markets. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. John, great to have you with us again. Let's start with some of the latest numbers that we're getting. Wholesale prices, as I mentioned, rose faster than expected in July. The producer price index jumped 0.9% month on month, 3.3% annually. That is the largest increase in 3 years. So what does this tell us about the health of the United States economy and where it's heading?
Well, it's easily forgotten, and I think economists forget it the most, that the surest sign of economic growth is falling prices. It's a sign you're fully connected with the rest of the world that's trying to create for you at the lowest possible price for the best market. But it also means that in being connected with the rest of the world, you're producing most efficiently. This goes back to Adam Smith. One man working alone in a pin factory can produce 1 pin per day, but several men working together can produce tens of thousands. When you try to break up the interconnectedness of this, without a doubt, it's going to reflect itself in prices. This is unfortunately what the Trump administration wants, but it's also the effect of taxes on the natural cooperation among workers and machines around the world.
So when you talk about this connection, is there a disconnect right now?
Well, I think there's a disconnect in thinking that somehow people are hurt by imports. But imports are the surest sign of gain, of benefit. The world isn't lined up to export to Haiti, but it is to the United States. And why? Because Americans are incredibly productive.
Yeah.
And why are they incredibly productive? Well, they are simply because they've always been connected with the world in such a way that they were doing what they could do best, what elevates them most uniquely, and the rest of the world was working alongside them.
Yeah. John, one other quick point before we move on. I mean, we've been told often that the stock market is not the economy, but it is an indicator, a barometer of investor confidence. How is the Wall Street reacting to this?
Well, I think the stock market is the economy. It's a look into the future of where investors think the economy is going. My sense right now is people will say, well, stocks are near all-time highs, and that's no doubt true. What we have to consider is the unseen. So there's a relief rally aspect to this, that tariffs weren't as bad as they were expected to be. But really, where could stocks be if the U.S. were where it was in 2020, or actually in 2015, when we were much more connected to the global economy, much fewer of these taxes on natural cooperation?
Arthur Dong, the consumer price index, also known more commonly as the inflation rate, increased slightly this month at 0.2%, and the annual rate at 2.7%. I mean, this is a number that is very closely watched. What's behind these increases, and how big a role are the tariffs playing?
Yes, thank you, Anand, for having me on the set today. It's always great to join you. Yes, the CPI numbers that were released just the other day reflected the July numbers, and Wall Street greeted those numbers with a bit of euphoria, in that they thought that the inflation numbers, as far as consumers are concerned, were in line with their expectations, which also implies that the Fed may go ahead in September and lower interest rates. But that euphoria soon faded with today's PPI numbers, as you just indicated, which signals a harbinger of what's to come in terms of inflation. Because when the wholesale prices go up, and they've gone up in the most radical fashion in the last 3 years, This is certainly a signal which Wall Street digested with a bit of indigestion that prices indeed will be transferred to the consumer in a very short period of time. So we can expect inflationary impact as a result of these PPI numbers. It's certainly a harbinger and an ominous sign in terms of the directionality of prices that are certainly going to affect the consumer in a very short period of time.
And Arthur, these increases that we are seeing, they have not yet fully factored in tariffs, have they?
They haven't been they haven't manifested themselves on the store shelves as yet, because the transmission mechanism by which wholesale prices then translate into retail prices, well, that takes a certain amount of time for that to take effect. But we should also note that Wall Street is actually quite aware that the consumer price index in July didn't spike up as radically because many of the import tariffs were set to begin in August 1st.
Right.
So there's a delay there with regard to the July numbers, and also many manufacturers and retailers have front-loaded and sort of over-committed themselves to inventory with the awareness that tariffs will definitely have an impact on future supplies. So they bought more in order to sell at a more reasonable price. But you know, that sort of impact and effect and advantage is going to disappear quite soon.
And Arthur, what is the likelihood of interest rate cuts later this year, possibly in September? In fact, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, says he expects an aggressive interest rate cut in September.
Yeah, the Wall Street is, baking in anywhere between a 60 to 90 basis point cut in interest rates. But I would caution not to act so quickly, because a part of the Fed's decision is their eye on unemployment. And we've seen the unemployment numbers starting to trickle upwards. And so this is a cause for concern, and that was expressed by Austin Goolsbee of the Chicago Fed, that they might take another look with regard to how aggressively they want to lower their interest rates in September.
Joseph Williams, good to see you, Joseph. Let's talk a little bit more, Joseph, about those unemployment numbers. The U.S. government slashed 12,000 jobs in July. The manufacturing sector lost 11,000 jobs, and nearly 2 million people, as I mentioned, also filed for unemployment benefits. We also hear that employers are pulling back on hiring. Unemployment is still low at 4%, but these numbers are distorted, aren't they? They don't give us the real picture, do they?
Well, they do in a sense. They're kind of a lagging indicator in that you won't know how many people are unemployed this month until next month, and it doesn't really give a clear picture of actually what's happening. Keep in mind, it's only been recent months since the Supreme Court gave Donald Trump the green light to continue firing federal workers. There was a pause there for a while it was on legal appeal, but now those cuts are starting to take effect. And those people are starting to show up on unemployment rolls in Maryland, in Virginia, areas around the DMV, and probably areas around the country, because the federal government, even though it's located in the United States, have offices and workers across the country, and different cities are going to start feeling those impacts. So I think that what's happening now is a lot of decisions that got made in January and in February are starting to catch up with the economy. Anecdotally, I was my dentist the other day, getting a cleaning on my pearly whites, and he told me that he is experiencing a lag in his patients, mainly because a lot of patients that went to him were federal employees who have lost their health insurance. So now his books are getting wider and wider open because he's not having those patients come in. And I think that's the kind of evidence that we're going to start to see, especially when the numbers aren't going to be necessarily trustworthy, depending on who gets in charge of the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Right. I want to talk about the Bureau of Labor Statistics in a moment, Brandon Bryce. But first, what is your view broadly on where the U.S. economy is right now?
Well, I mean, right now, it's a mixed bag. I mean, we saw growth in the second quarter, about 3% growth. The challenge right now, I think, with Trump, if you're Trump, you're watching those inflation. You want to keep it from inflation. You want to make sure that when you look at the states and those who voted for you, these are the people that are probably most likely going to be impacted. States like Michigan, when you start to look at laborers and parts and supplies that come from overseas, from Canada, And so I think right now, as long as if unemployment stays down, the president looks good. When those numbers begin to spike, when inflation begins to become a reality, that's when you're nervous if you're the president. The other thing is, one concept that folks is not talking about with not just automation, but some of these jobs, they were never coming back. And so when you think of, here's a concept for you, Anand, maybe the country needs to start taxing the robots. We're seeing those jobs being decimated through automation and AI. Maybe we need to start reframing the way that we look at our tax structure.
Right, and talking about labor, Brandon, I mean, we have to rely on the numbers, don't we? This week the president nominated the conservative economist E.J. Antoni as the new commissioner for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's after the president fired the former commissioner after a poor jobs report. This is what the president had to say. Let's listen.
I've had issues with the numbers for a long time, but we're doing so well. I believe the numbers were phony, just like they were before the election, and there were other times. So you know what I did? I fired her. Right. And you know what? I did the right thing.
So, Brandon, what are we to make of a president who fires the messenger because he doesn't like the message?
Anand, we've seen this. We saw this in The Apprentice. This is nothing new. This is who Donald Trump is. But let me caution, the devil's in the details when it comes to the numbers. We can always shape the numbers the way we want them to be. The question is, I go back to my earlier statement is, look at the numbers. If unemployment stays low, the president looks good. When those numbers begin to creep, that's when there's a problem. So again, I mean, this is who Donald Trump is. I mean, ironically, he hasn't fired that many people this year as it was the first term. But again, this is the Donald. He was sent here, promises made, promises kept, and apparently he's following that promise of reducing the size of Washington with whatever it takes and whatever the cost may be.
John, what is your view on what the president is doing? I mean, the investors and economists, they depend on reliable numbers, and there appears to be a pattern of Trump wanting to fire the bearers of bad news. He's now lashed out at Goldman Sachs, at the CEO of Goldman Sachs, David Solomon, after the investment bank predicted that consumers will bear about 2/3 of the cost of these increased tariffs when they fully kick in, and that'll be by the autumn. What is your view on that?
Well, I think it's very telling, his response to Goldman Sachs. Remember, Goldman Sachs is a private company that comes up with its own numbers. And so think about that in terms of unemployment. Isn't it odd that all this time, when we've got ADP, the largest payroll company in the United States, that would have a better sense of unemployment than any entity in the United States, and that produces its own unemployment number every single month? Why is it that we had and have a BLS in the first place? I hear what you're saying about the need for reliability of statistics, but any number that's important is already produced in the private sector as is. And so I think a lot of this is a lot of overdone stuff. Whether it's E.J. Antoni or anyone, the true number's going to come out, and stock market price is reality, not fake numbers, no matter if they're created, who's creating them inside, or if they're not creating them inside government.
Arthur Dong, there appears to be a rush right now to get goods into the country before those tariffs fully kick in. And we look at some of the numbers from the Los Angeles port. It saw a record month in July, processing about 1 million containers. I mean, this might protect consumers for a little while, but what happens when those stocks run out?
Yeah, when the stocks and the supplies start to dwindle, companies are going to have to reorder their inventory. And so facing this challenge in terms of tariff uncertainty, many companies have sort of restrained their sort of reordering as a result of the uncertainty, and exporters from different parts of the world have been holding back on sending orders, not knowing exactly where the tariffs are going to land. And so we're coming up to the busiest quarter of the entire year, and that's the fourth quarter, which is the holiday season. And I dare say that many American families are going to be surprised that there are going to be less presents under the tree, as many of the things they come to depend on and enjoy over the holiday seasons are going to go up in price.
John, none of this should be a surprise to us, isn't it? Because President Trump, I mean, he broadcasted this even when he was campaigning for office for his second term. He told us that tariffs were going to be one of his big things. The other thing he told us was that he was going to bring back manufacturing to the United States. And now we hear that the computer giant Apple is planning on investing $100 billion in domestic manufacturing. And the company says it's working to bring more of its supply chain to the United States. What do you make of this? I mean, is this a win for President Trump?
I think history says it's not. Let's never forget that Americans depopulated some of the manufacturing cities because they hated those jobs. I mean, it's been a cultural truism of the United States for decades that people grew up near factories and mills, and their goal was to get to somewhere else. And so the closure of factories didn't kill those cities and towns. It was the existence of those factories for too long. New York City 100 years ago was the biggest manufacturing city of all. Los Angeles was number 4. Flint and Milwaukee were 2 and 3. What are the 2 cities that are thriving today? Well, Flint and Milwaukee are afterthoughts. Los Angeles and New York are thriving, and they're thriving precisely because they moved the work of the past out. They let it go elsewhere. And so this idea that you can bring back a glorious past is not only economically bankrupt, but it ignores why these cities declined in the first place. To me, bringing back jobs is like firebombing a city, but it's actually worse because it drives away the people most essential to progress in that city.
So why then, John, would Apple do something like this?
Right now, it's unfortunate. I don't think any of us here could love it if we're for free markets. There's a view that you've got to placate the man in the White House. This is not historically how we do things in the United States. It's not how we should do things in the United States, simply because markets work best when they're constantly correcting mistakes and pushing money toward good ideas. In this case, we have a president driving the most valuable companies on earth to bring back what they've never done here in the first place, simply because they're most efficient and most productive when they let the rest of the world produce the goods for them while they design them here. That's good jobs for designers, but it's also good job for the people who cluster around them. Look at Silicon Valley. Look at the whole area. There are jobs for personal trainers, for investment bankers, for lawyers, for dentists, for chefs, for personal chefs. Go down the list. Where there's innovation, where cities are not stuck in the past, jobs are everywhere.
Brandon, President Trump claims that these tariffs are, well, the United States is raking in billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, he said, from these increased tariffs. And if we look at the numbers, according to the U.S. Treasury, the U.S. has collected $142 billion so far for this fiscal year. That fiscal year ends in September. But how does this get through to ordinary consumers? I mean, how does it help ordinary Americans?
Well, again, I go back to, when you look at who's being impacted by this, it's those factory workers. And keep in mind, the factory of the 1970s is not the factory now. Now, you would almost think you were on a Silicon Valley campus, because the whole concept of factory has changed. But let me get back to this. When you look at who's being impacted, it's those building trades guys, the guys that actually supported the president and wanted to keep the jobs here. Well, they'll keep them here. The challenge is, when you think of places like Detroit, who's going to buy the cars? When you think about places like, when you're building homes and you need to recruit parts from overseas, and it takes you, forever. Those are the things that are going to start to hold up, probably, hopefully, come next year, where there's going to be a slow pace in hiring. Hiring is going to be a lot slower than it was before. There's going to be a slow pace in orders being met. And so, again, I go back to, if you're the president, you're monitoring not only the labor markets, but you're also monitoring how is this going to impact the common worker that supports Trump. I mean, when you think of even the South, where they're buying these parts, those are the folks that are probably going to be most impacted.
Yeah.
So part of that is messaging from the president, but also part of that is the president being able to communicate his vision for why tariffs are important, and not just making it happen and then letting them decide or feel the impact or the crush.
Joseph Williams, I want to take a deeper look right now at one specific sector, one specific industry. That's the hospitality industry, specifically the restaurant industry. It's experiencing a wave of closures right now. Big chains like Applebee's as well as Denny's are closing a number of their restaurants. Here in Washington, there are 2 restaurants that close their doors every week. Here's CGTN's Kate Fisher with more on what's going on there.
Restaurants across the United States are struggling, especially here in the nation's capital, where the Restaurant Association of Metropolitan Washington says that so far this year, 53 restaurants have already closed. Now, that's almost double the 28 that had closed this time last year. It also says that new restaurant openings are down by 17%. Now, it blames a law that came into effect in Washington in 2023, which raised the minimum wage for tipped workers. And restaurants say that led to increased labor costs, job losses, and then ultimately restaurant closures. And it comes as government figures show that US job growth in general slowed more than expected across the country in July, while the prior month's data was also revised sharply lower. And some economists warn that tariffs may be playing into these losses that's reflected in this data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
This was a stunner of a report, and you have to look past the initial headlines on this to really understand what is so stunning about it. What really grabs you by the throat here is that we had downward revisions for payrolls, making for a total loss of 258,000 jobs in May and June. The question really is, are tariffs, the uncertainty and certainty of tariffs in the economy really prompting employers to hit the pause button? And you have to say that's what's been happening over the past several months now.
Well, the job losses are certainly being felt here in Washington, D.C.'s once thriving hospitality industry, where restaurant closures are set to hit 100 by the end of this year, surpassing the already record-breaking 73 for last year. Kate Fisher, CGTN, Washington.
So, Joseph, I mean, listening to that report there, this is going to affect hundreds, well, thousands of people, really, when we talk about the number of restaurants that are going to close. I mean, specifically here in Washington, is this actually a knock-on effect, by the fact that so many federal workers have lost their jobs here?
Well, I think there's a through line here, and the through line indicates that these are the results of decisions made by Trump himself. I mean, think about it. Many restaurant workers were Latinos, a fair portion of them, if they weren't undocumented, certainly are now fearful of going to work. Number 2, we've got higher prices on goods across the board, certainly fruits and vegetables and meats, with tariffs imposed on some imported portions of those products, really hitting restaurateurs hard. The third is there aren't very many people in the federal government who can afford to buy a $50 meal now or go out to dinner 2 and 3 times a week because they don't have jobs or they are uncertain about the job that they do have, and so they're kind of hunkering down. So I think all of it is kind of compacted and compressed into one tiny industry or one subset of an industry that really indicates what's going on here. And that's kind of what's troubling about the fact that we're having some discourse about whether or not the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I mean, yes, private sector creates their numbers, but the BLS has the full force and credit of the government behind it, if you will, in making sure that those numbers are pinpoint accurate and that the government stands behind them in order for private sector people to make their decisions. But in any case, we've got a system that's not really built to withstand these kinds of shocks because it's all very fragile. And if you have Trump coming in and disrupting the entire system, one sector at a time, or making one decision that ruptures across entire sectors, you're going to have this kind of an outcome. And regardless of what the BLS stats say, if they're legit or if they're not, you are going to see in real-time effects that hurt real people, force restaurants to close, force people to spend fewer dollars at the grocery store, and it's not going, real reality is going to overtake the numbers every single time.
John, we've just got a few minutes left, and I'm going to talk about one other development, another disturbing development in some ways, and that is the number of women who are leaving the workforce. The Bureau of Labor Statistics says about 3% of women with young children have left their jobs between January and June this year. And one of the reasons for that is that many companies are now requiring all their workers to come back to the office. No more work from home. I mean, what are the consequences for the economy if this continues?
Well, it's a great question, and I think it somewhat dovetails with the previous one. Washington, D.C. was killed. The restaurant industry was the first big hit on it was the lockdowns that resulted in so many of those restaurants just basically being empty day after day after day, and they've never really recovered because people never came back to the office. And so this impacted a lot of cities, certainly Washington, D.C. I'm sympathetic to businesses. It's the old saying that when the cat's away, the mice will play. We act differently around our bosses. We act differently at the office. If you look at the best U.S. companies, they have headquarters not because they're vain, but because they want to inculcate the culture into the people showing up every day. Goldman Sachs calls them culture carriers. Steve Jobs, before he died, created an all-new headquarters for Apple as a way to ensure more and more bumping into each other on a daily basis so that ideas can be exchanged. And so this idea that we can just kind of mail it in, or we could, even if we can work hard from home, that overtakes the genius of people working together, I think is mistaken. And so my heart goes out to some of the mothers who had gotten used to an old way of doing things. But if we want to keep the jobs, if we want the U.S. to be one of the great economic success stories that it always is, I think part and parcel of this is a headquarters that people show up to every day, if not 4 days a week.
Brandon, very quickly, what are your thoughts on that? I've got about 20 seconds.
I mean, I agree with my colleague. I sympathize, but the reality is when you look at the amount of fraud and when you look at the amount of waste of people that were at home collecting a check but not going to work, I think these, especially when you talk about the federal government, these were issues that I think the president wanted to address. But I agree, women, that's a big factor in our labor market, and for them to be impacted by that, I think it's a detriment to the economy.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.